Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really digging into something huge, one of humanity's most lasting and honestly kind of baffling paradoxes. It's this thing where we see incredible collective progress, right? But it exists right alongside these really deep systemic inequalities.
Yeah, it's always been there, hasn't it?
It has. I mean,
Yeah.
how did we get here? We started out apparently in these pretty egalitarian bands.
Right.
So how did we end up with such rigid hierarchies? Where a tiny few control so much wealth, power, education, health. It's kind of mind-boggling.
It really is a puzzle. And that's our mission today, isn't it? To use an AI-driven analysis to try and get at the why and the who behind it all.
Behind systemic inequality, social stratification.
Yeah.
Fancy terms for it.
Exactly. We're aiming to pull back the curtain a bit on the architecture of how human disparity is actually built.
And we're using a really interesting framework for this, something we're calling the science of human priorities.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, the idea is it's not just about describing how things are. It's more ambitious. It's about using solid evidence-based methods, data, AI modeling, to consciously design society how it should be.
Okay, so it's normative. It makes a claim about what's good.
Right. It says we can actually choose what we optimize for as a society. Things like, say, justice, equity, sustainability, broad well-being for everyone.
And the science part.
That's where the AI comes in, using its analytical power to model how different structures, different policies, actually line up with those goals we choose. Democratically chosen goals, ideally.
Okay, got it. So it's a lens to look at the past, understand now, and maybe sketch out a better future.
Exactly. It's our guide for this whole deep dive. So our mission's clear. Use AI to understand, maybe even help redesign things. But, to build that better future, we first have to get how we got here.
Makes sense.
Let's plunge into those deep roots of disparity. And when you apply this science of human priorities lens, this AI analysis, to our past, well, the first thing that jumps out is just how equal things used to be, relatively speaking.
That's such a critical starting point. Our models, looking at all this anthropological data, they consistently show that for most of human history, like the vast majority, we lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. And the key thing was this remarkable egalitarianism. They actively, consciously worked to prevent hierarchies from sticking.
And there's an amazing example, the Khoisan peoples insulting the meat.
Oh, yeah. Fascinating, isn't it? A hunter brings back a big kill, something everyone needs.
And instead of praise,
They get teased, downplayed. Ritually, but it wasn't mean-spirited. It was, like you said, a social technology.
Right, designed specifically to stop anyone getting too proud, accumulating too much status, keep things level.
Exactly. It just shows that these stratified societies we live in now, they're actually quite recent. Not our default setting, you could say.
So what was the big rupture, the Neolithic Revolution, right, around 10,000 years ago?
That's the one. The shift to settled agriculture. Huge. Because for the very first time, people could produce and, crucially, store more food than they immediately needed.
An agricultural surplus.
And that surplus was the catalyst. It created what our analysis terms the inequality possibility frontier.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Think of it like a pie. In a pure subsistence group, everyone needs all the pie just to survive. There's no extra slice for someone to grab.
Right.
But once you have surplus food, now there's a pie that can be divided unequally. Suddenly, it's possible for a small group to control that surplus, to accumulate it.
And that creates the gap.
That creates the potential for a permanent gap between the powerful and the powerless. Our AI models show this surplus as a clear, sharp turning point in how human societies organize themselves.
And you saw the effects pretty quickly, didn't you? The codifying of hierarchy.
Oh yeah, almost immediately in historical terms. Suddenly you get concepts like private land ownership.
Which didn't really exist before in the same way.
Not really. And specialized labor priests, warriors, farmers. And then the rise of city-states. You see it everywhere. Mayans, Aztecs, Rome, Han China. Clear lines between rulers, priests, commoners.
And it wasn't just about force. These hierarchies were often, justified.
Yeah, absolutely. Sophisticated religious beliefs played a massive role. Rulers were often presented as divinely chosen,
Making their power seem legitimate, natural even.
Exactly. And this era also saw really extreme forms of stratification. Slavery, for instance, though it's important to flag the unique hereditary racial basis of chattel slavery later in the U.S.
And rigid caste systems, too.
Yeah.
Born into your place, basically no way out.
Right, zero mobility. And as societies got bigger, more complex, these systems became even more formal. Think about feudalism in medieval Europe.
Classic example, the three estates. Nobility, clergy, commoners.
And land ownership was everything. The king owned it all notionally and then parceled it out to nobles for loyalty.
Power flowed from land.
And it was locked down by some powerful ideas and rules. The divine right of kings, for one.
Question the king, you're questioning God.
Pretty much. And things like primogeniture, the eldest son inherits everything. That kept wealth and power stuck within the same elite families for generation after generation. Multi-generational inequality baked right in.
Then comes the next big wave.
Yeah.
Colonialism. Starting around the 15th century, European powers basically exported these hierarchical systems worldwide.
And our analysis is really clear on this. It wasn't just about political flags on maps. It was fundamentally a brutal system of economic extraction.
Taking wealth out.
Massively. Creating huge fortunes for the colonizers by exploiting resources, exploiting labor, and deliberately impoverishing the colonized lands in the process.
So the example of Haiti is just devastating.
Staggering. They win independence from France, a huge achievement after a slave revolt.
Great.
And then they're forced to pay this enormous sum, 150 million francs, like $21 billion today, not to the people who were enslaved, but to the French slave owners for their lost property.
Unbelievable.
It crushed the country's finances from day one, locked it into poverty cycles that, honestly, you can still trace today. And what's really striking is how that pattern continues. This idea of billionaire colonialism today. The Global South is estimated to pay something like $30 million every hour in debt servicing to the Global North.
$30 million an hour.
Per hour. It's a direct echo of that old extractive logic, just using financial instruments instead of, gunboats quite so obviously.
Wow. Okay, so then the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
18th, 19th centuries. Another huge shift.
Right. Now, capital money, factories, machines starts to replace land as the main source of power.
Rise of the industrial capitalists.
Exactly. And the creation of this huge urban working class, think of the American Gilded Age, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, Vanderbilts.
The robber barons.
And the wealth concentration was just astronomical. By 1890, the richest 1% in the U.S. owned about a quarter of everything.
A quarter of the entire country's assets.
Yeah, and just like with divine right before, this new stark inequality needed a new justification.
Enter social Darwinism.
Right. Herbert Spencer, Survival of the Fittest. The argument basically was that being rich meant you were morally superior, biologically fitter. And being poor, well, that was your own fault, a sign of inferiority.
A convenient justification for doing nothing about poverty.
Absolutely. It legitimized laissez-faire capitalism, minimal government, let the fittest thrive. And you can see echoes of that, really, in the modern myth of meritocracy.
It's fascinating. Looking back with this science of human priorities lens, you see this recurring pattern, don't you?
Definitely. The specific ways elites extract resources change. Maybe it's land rents, then colonial profits, then industrial capital.
But the basic process stays the same. Someone's accumulating, someone's losing out.
Precisely. And what changes most dramatically, maybe, are the stories they tell to justify it. Divine right, the civilizing mission of colonialism, survival of the fittest, meritocracy, they all work to make these man-made power structures seem natural or deserved.
And this leads to a really crucial insight from the AI models, doesn't it? The ratchet effect of technology.
Yes. Our simulations highlight this again and again. Big technological breakthroughs, agriculture, industry, and now AI, they expand that inequality possibility frontier. They make the potential pie bigger.
Right.
But they also massively increase the potential for that wealth to get concentrated at the top unless, and this is the key point, unless we consciously build systems to share the gains broadly.
It doesn't happen automatically.
Not at all. History shows it ratchets up inequality without strong countervailing forces. And that is a huge flashing warning sign for the age of AI.
Okay, so that's the history of the architecture. Let's bring it to today. If we want to unpack modern inequality, our AI needs good theories, right? Frameworks to understand power and class now.
Right. And we can definitely start with Marx. His focus on the conflict between owners, the bourgeoisie, and workers, the proletariat. It's still incredibly relevant.
Especially that idea of surplus value extraction.
Exactly. How profit is generated from labor. Now, just imagine. AI systems owning the means of production, performing both physical and cognitive labor.
Wow, yeah. That takes Marx's core idea to a whole new level. Who gets the surplus value then?
Precisely. It sharpens the conflict massively. But Marx isn't the whole story. Weber added important layers.
Right. He didn't just focus on economics.
No, Weber brought in status, social prestige, honor, and party political power. He argued these, alongside economic class, all shape your life chances. It's more multidimensional.
It helps explain things like the middle class better, maybe.
Yeah, it gives a more nuanced picture. And you can see how AI might affect all three dimensions: your job status, your political influence through data, not just your income.
And we should also mention C. Wright Mills, the power elite.
Definitely. His point that real power, certainly in America, might be concentrated in a pretty small, interlocked group from corporations, the military, the government, that raises big questions about democracy.
Okay, so using these ideas, Marx, Weber, Mills, how do they help us understand the actual engines driving inequality today? Let's start with corporate power.
Okay. The dominant model, shareholder value maximization, fundamentally prioritizes owners and investors, often explicitly over workers, communities, the environment.
And the data shows the impact of that.
Oh, massively. We see systematic wage suppression. You mentioned the figure 800 million workers globally saw real wages drop behind inflation recently, and that's a $1.5 trillion loss for them.
While at the same time.
While $82 out of every $100 of profit from big companies went straight to wealthy shareholders. It's a huge wealth transfer.
And then there's the tax issue.
Right. Corporate tax rates have plummeted. OECD countries, average rates basically halved since 1980. That's trillions in lost revenue for public services, schools, hospitals, infrastructure.
Which then leads to privatization.
Often, yes. Turning essentials like water, healthcare, even education into commodities to be bought and sold, which almost always leads to unequal access. You get privatized profits, but the risks often get pushed back onto the public.
And we can't ignore the role of some industries, like fossil fuels, in driving climate breakdown while lobbying hard against action.
Absolutely. The costs of climate change fall disproportionately on the poorest, while the profits have been enormous. It's another facet of this extractive logic.
And that statistic about billionaire wealth,
Mm-hmm.
it really challenges the whole meritocracy idea.
It does. 60% of billionaire wealth, the data suggests, isn't primarily from some brilliant new invention. It's from inherited fortunes or monopoly power rigging the market, or sometimes just cozy relationships with government.
So alongside corporate power, there's this other engine, financialization. What exactly is that?
Think of it as the economy becoming dominated by financial markets and motives. So a company that used to make most of its money actually making something, say cars, now might make more profit from trading stocks, bonds, derivatives, complex financial stuff. Finance takes over the real economy in a way.
And how does that fuel inequality?
Well, it channels income away from wages and towards profits and dividends, which benefits those who own assets. Remember that stat? The richest 10% in the U.S. own 89% of all stocks.
So the gains from financial activity flow overwhelmingly to the top.
Exactly. And it also changes incentives.
Right.
Why invest heavily in your workforce or long-term R&D if you can make quicker profits through financial engineering?
Which also fuels that massive gap between CEO pay and worker pay.
Right, because executive pay is often tied to stock performance. And as wages stagnate for ordinary people,
They rely more on debt.
Precisely. Household debt in the U.S. has exploded since 1980 relative to income. And who profits from all that debt? The financial sector, largely.
Okay, so you have immense corporate and financial power, and then that power bleeds into politics, the vicious spiral.
That's the term. Economic inequality translates into political inequality, which then creates rules that further increase economic inequality. It feeds itself.
State capture, essentially. How does it work on the ground?
Lobbying is huge. Billions spent every year, over $1.4 billion in the U.S. in 2020 alone, just trying to influence legislation and regulations.
Buying access, shaping the rules.
It creates what some economists call a captured economy, where the rules of the game are increasingly written by the most powerful players for their own benefit.
Like a rigged game.
In many ways, yes. And campaign finance is another key mechanism. Politicians rely on funding from wealthy donors and corporations.
Which makes them more responsive to those donors than to average citizens.
Studies bear this out pretty starkly. When the policy preferences of the wealthy differ from those of the poor or middle class, guess whose preferences usually win out?
The wealthy.
Almost exclusively. The end result is leaning towards plutocracy government by and for the rich. And that seriously erodes public trust, risks instability.
So that's the hardware, the economic and political structures. But you also mentioned the software, the psychology, the culture that props it all up.
Right. We seem to have this innate tendency to rank ourselves and others. You know, Dominance hierarchies, prestige hierarchies.
And the you versus them thing seems pretty fundamental, too.
It does. Social identity theory explains how easily we form groups, favor our own in-group, and look down on the out-group. That's a basic building block of prejudice.
And then there are the less obvious biases. Implicit bias, microaggression.
Exactly. Those unconscious stereotypes that lead to subtle, maybe unintentional slights and exclusions. But they add up. They perpetuate inequality systemically.
And there's also this weird tendency for people to defend the system, even if it disadvantages them.
Yeah, system justification theory. It's the psychological need many people have to believe the system they live in is basically fair and legitimate. It makes the status quo very sticky, very hard to challenge because people rationalize it.
And on a bigger cultural scale, there's ethnocentrism.
Right, seeing your own culture as the standard, as superior. Historically, that was used to justify colonialism, racism, terrible violence, and you still hear echoes of it in political rhetoric today, stoking fear of the other.
Which ties into debates about assimilation versus multiculturalism.
It does. But the evidence we see, especially through the science of human priorities lens, strongly suggests that diversity, when it's managed inclusively, isn't a weakness, it's a massive source of strength. Creativity, innovation, resilience, even economic dynamism in well-being economies.
So what's the big takeaway here about these psychological and cultural forces?
The crucial insight is that they act almost like a social immune system, protecting the existing hierarchy. And very often, the narratives we hear frame social problems as horizontal conflicts. Blaming immigrants, pitting working class groups against each other.
Instead of looking vertically.
Exactly. Instead of focusing on the vertical extraction of wealth and power by a tiny elite, this fractures any sense of shared interest among the majority, what Marx called class consciousness.
So if you want to create change, what does that imply?
It means movements for equity have to fight on two fronts. It's got to be a dual project. You need the economic redistribution, changing the structures, and you need the cultural work, fostering empathy, building bridges between groups, and crucially, helping people see clearly where the real conflict lies between the vast majority and the tiny elite benefiting from the current system. It has to be both.
Okay, let's pivot now to the defining force of our time. AI. It really does feel like a double-edged sword for inequality.
Absolutely. It could massively accelerate it or potentially help us mitigate it.
Let's start with the economic impact. Automation, job displacement. The numbers are pretty stark.
They are. Projections like, nearly a quarter of all jobs changing by 2027? Up to 30% of U.S. work hours potentially automated by 2030, especially with generative AI now.
It sounds huge. What kind of jobs are most affected?
Well, the effects are complex. You'll likely see big displacement in routine tasks, clerical work, data entry, some manufacturing roles, but you'll also see new jobs created: AI specialists, data scientists, ethicists, trainers.
The net effect.
The World Economic Forum projected a net loss of about 14 million jobs globally by 2027. But maybe the bigger, more immediate danger isn't just mass unemployment.
What then?
Severe wage polarization. Our models suggest AI is much better at replacing tasks done by low and middle skill workers, while it tends to augment the productivity of high skill workers.
So it splits the labor market.
Potentially, yes, cleaving it in two. The IMF found something like 60% of jobs in advanced economies are exposed to AI impacts, with lower wage jobs being more vulnerable to displacement. Imagine 20–30% of the workforce suddenly finding their economic value plummeting. That's a recipe for social and political disaster.
And corporations have a huge incentive to push this automation, right?
Massive incentive. Cutting labor costs, boosting output. It's the relentless logic of capitalism. Unless we actively shape how AI is deployed, it will likely drive down the value of many kinds of human work.
Okay, so that's the economic side. But AI is also a social force, and there's this big concern about algorithmic bias.
Huge concern. This is where AI systems systematically produce unfair outcomes for certain groups, often marginalized ones. And it's often not intentional malice, it's baked into the data or the design.
How does the bias get in there?
Several ways. Biased data is a big one. If you train a hiring algorithm on historical data from a company that mostly hired men...
It learns that bias.
Exactly. It might penalize perfectly qualified women. We've seen facial recognition systems that are much less accurate for people with darker skin tones.
Because they were trained mostly on lighter faces.
Right. Algorithms themselves can be flawed, maybe using something like zip code as a proxy for race unintentionally. And then, of course, the biases of the human developers can creep in too.
And the real danger is when these biased systems make critical decisions.
That's the nightmare scenario. Hiring, loan applications, criminal justice sentencing, access to healthcare. If biased algorithms are making calls in these areas, they can systematically deny opportunities, reinforcing existing inequalities.
And it's hidden.
That's the insidious part. It's often invisible, wrapped in this veneer of technological objectivity. If you get denied a loan by a biased AI, you might never know why. You just internalize it as your own failing.
It creates this sort of digital stratification.
Exactly. Automated, scalable, and incredibly hard to see, let alone challenge. It's a really powerful new mechanism for entrenching inequality.
But the flip side, AI can be used for good, right? The AI for social good movement.
Absolutely. There's immense potential here. This is where we can really apply that science of human priorities, using AI to optimize for well-being, for sustainability, for equity.
And we're already seeing examples.
Definitely. In environmental protection, AI helps monitor pollution, predict wildfires or floods, even track illegal fishing boats.
Saving lives and ecosystems.
All right. In global health, AI can help detect diseases like cancer or TB from scans, especially in areas with few doctors. There are mental health chatbots offering support.
What about aid?
Humanitarian aid uses AI for predicting crises, getting vital info to refugees like the Signpost Project does. There are chatbots giving farming advice to smallholders in developing countries.
Education, too.
Personalized learning platforms, real-time translation tools, breaking down language barriers, and even in justice, you have groups using AI to help draft legal documents for asylum seekers or provide unbiased info on animal welfare. The potential is huge.
So how do we get the good AI without the bad AI? How do we ensure fairness?
It's not easy. Solving algorithmic bias is critical. Our science of human priorities models show it needs a multi-layered approach.
Like what?
Better data governance, making sure the data AI learns from is representative and fair. Designing algorithms specifically with fairness metrics built in. Demanding transparency and explainability, we need to understand why an AI made a decision, especially a critical one. No more black boxes.
And accountability.
Absolutely. Clear lines of responsibility, oversight mechanisms, regulations like the EU's AI Act. It needs technical solutions, ethical guidelines, and legal frameworks working together.
So when you step back and look at AI's impact,
Yeah.
it feels like it really ups the stakes on everything we've discussed.
It really does. Our deep dive suggests AI fundamentally changes the nature of capital itself. You now have non-human intelligence that can do both physical and cognitive work.
Which will create unprecedented wealth, presumably.
An unprecedented economic surplus, yes. Expanding that inequality possibility frontier to a degree we can barely imagine. The old conflict Marx described, owners of capital versus labor, could become owners of intelligence systems versus, well, everyone else.
And if ownership of that AI stays concentrated in a few hands,
the resulting inequality could make the Gilded Age look like a picnic. Truly dystopian levels of disparity. This makes the question of AI ownership and governance perhaps the single most important issue of our time.
it's not just about job retraining, then.
Far from it. It's about who benefits from this incredible new form of wealth creation. How do we democratize the gains from this intelligence that really is built on collective human knowledge and data?
It ties back to Weber, too, doesn't it? That iron cage idea.
Chillingly so. Biased AI systems could become the ultimate impersonal bureaucracy, enforcing inequality automatically, opaquely, without any possibility of human empathy or appeal.
This computer says no.
Exactly. So the fight for algorithmic fairness isn't just some technical niche. It's a fundamental political and ethical battle for due process, for human agency, for a just future in the 21st century.
Wow. Okay. So we've traced the roots, dissected the modern engines, grappled with AI. How do we actually chart a course forward? Where do we find our compass?
Well, before jumping to policy solutions, it's really helpful to ground ourselves in the core ethical debate. And the clash between John Rawls and Robert Nozick really frames it perfectly.
Rawls and the veil of ignorance.
Right. Rawls' thought experiment in A Theory of Justice. Imagine you're designing society, but you don't know who you'll be in it. Rich, poor, male, female, healthy, sick. What rules would you choose?
To be safe, basically.
He argued rational people would choose two main principles. First, the liberty principle. Everyone gets the maximum basic liberties compatible with the same liberties for others.
Fair enough.
And the second, the social and economic principle. This one's key. It says inequalities are only okay if, 1, they benefit the least advantaged members of society, the difference principle, and 2, they're attached to positions open to everyone under fair equality of opportunity.
So inequality isn't inherently bad, but it has to lift the floor for everyone.
That's the idea. And it provides a really strong philosophical basis for things like progressive taxes, social safety nets, public investment, an active state working for fairness.
But Nozick came at it from a completely different angle.
Completely different. For Nozick, the absolute priority was individual liberty, self-ownership. His entitlement theory basically says, if you acquired something justly or received it through a just transfer from someone who acquired it justly, then it's yours, period.
Doesn't matter how unequal the outcome is.
Not inherently. His big argument was that any attempt to impose a specific pattern of distribution, like Rawls's difference principle, inevitably violates individual liberty. For Nozick, taxing earnings to redistribute wealth is morally the same as forced labor.
So a minimal state is the only just state for him. Protect property, enforce contracts, that's it.
Pretty much. So you have Rawls justifying a more active redistributive state for fairness, and Nozick championing near absolute individual liberty and minimal government. They really define the philosophical poles of the debate about inequality.
And understanding both is crucial for you, the listener, when you're thinking about potential solutions and their moral trade-offs.
Absolutely. It's the essential compass.
Okay, compass in hand, let's talk pathways, concrete policies, institutional reforms. What does a science of human priorities approach, informed by data, actually suggest? Starting with economic levers.
Well, a direct response to the extreme wealth concentration we see is, unsurprisingly, a wealth tax. Taxing accumulated assets, not just income. Maybe 1-3% a year on fortunes over, say, $50 million.
How does that stack up philosophically and practically?
From a Rawlsian view, it's a strong tool for justice. Makes the system fairer, raises revenue for public goods that benefit the least advantaged. But a Nozickian would see it as a clear violation of property rights. And practically, critics raise issues about valuation, administration, capital flight, potential legal challenges.
What about universal basic income? UBI. That's getting a lot of attention.
It is an unconditional cash payment to every citizen. The potential upsides are pretty compelling.
Like poverty reduction.
Big time. Studies from trials often show improved health, reduced poverty, sometimes even increased entrepreneurship. It can give workers more bargaining power, too, and in the context of AI...
it could be framed as a technology dividend.
Exactly. A way for everyone to share in the productivity gains from automation that we all collectively helped create. But of course, there are significant challenges.
The cost.
The cost is huge. Concerns about work incentives, the evidence there is actually quite mixed and complex, and questions about the most efficient way to target support. It's a really active area of debate and experimentation.
And then there's something maybe less controversial, but fundamental. Education and skills.
Absolutely fundamental. Massive, sustained public investment across the board, early childhood, K-12, higher ed, vocational training. Our analysis shows this is non-negotiable for genuine equality of opportunity.
Preparing people for the future of work.
And just enabling human flourishing. It's probably the closest thing to a point of convergence across different philosophical viewpoints. Investing in people.
But economic changes need political changes to stick. Right. Breaking that vicious cycle.
You absolutely have to address the political levers, too. Otherwise, the economic power just recaptures the state again. So, comprehensive campaign finance reform is critical.
Getting big money out of politics.
Moving towards public financing, much stronger disclosure laws, maybe revisiting court decisions like Citizens United in the U.S., and alongside that, much stricter regulation of lobbying.
Making influence transparent, limiting it.
Right, breaking down that captured economy. And foundational to all of this is protecting and expanding the right to vote. Automatic registration, restoring rights to formerly incarcerated people, combating voter suppression tactics.
Reclaiming democracy is the prerequisite.
It really is. Without a functioning democracy responsive to all citizens, achieving lasting economic or social equity is incredibly difficult.
Okay, finally, the social and cultural levers. Fostering inclusion, sustainability.
This involves actively promoting diversity and inclusion, countering that ethnocentrism we talked about through education, responsible media portrayals, encouraging genuine cross-cultural dialogue and understanding.
Moving beyond just tolerance to actual appreciation.
Yes. And a critical piece, especially now, is advancing environmental justice, recognizing that pollution, climate impacts, resource depletion, these burdens fall hardest on marginalized communities, communities of color, low-income groups.
So climate action and social justice have to go hand in hand.
They're inseparable. Initiatives like the U.S. Justice 40 Pledge, aiming to direct climate investments to disadvantaged communities, are a step in the right direction. Our science of human priorities models make it clear. You can't have lasting human well-being without ecological well-being, and both need equity.
Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground. Let's try to synthesize this through the lens of the science of human priorities. Remind us of the core idea again.
At its heart, it's a normative framework that says we should use our best tools, data, AI modeling, evidence to consciously design our social systems, not just letting them evolve or assuming GDP growth is the only goal.
But designing them to achieve specific, democratically chosen goals.
Exactly. Goals like human well-being, environmental sustainability, genuine equity, broad participation. It's about being intentional about the kind of society we want to build.
So using that framework, how can we answer some of those fundamental questions that listeners, that all of us grapple with? Like, what kind of culture should we cultivate to elect good leaders?
Our analysis points towards a culture that values justice-based leadership, looking for leaders committed to universal social and economic justice who understand power's potential to corrupt. And crucially, the science gives us tools to move beyond just rhetoric.
How so?
By holding leaders accountable to measurable outcomes, our child poverty rates falling, our public health metrics improving, our carbon emissions going down, it allows for evidence-based governance, not just judging based on promises or personality.
And what's the purpose of this science in creating a truly healthy, balanced society?
Its purpose is to help us transcend that ingrained ethnocentrism, to fully embrace multiculturalism, not just tolerate diversity, but see it as a vital source of strength and innovation, and equally, to respect planetary boundaries.
Living within our ecological means.
Right. The science can provide a common evidence-based language for different cultures to collaborate on shared global challenges, modeling how the economy, human well-being, and the environment all interact, aiming for holistic governance, not just siloed policies, optimizing for flourishing.
And that really tough one. Why do humans seem to have this tendency to break rules, to try and dominate or even eliminate other groups or cultures?
What our analysis strongly suggests is that this isn't some fixed, inevitable flaw in human nature. It's more often a predictable, toxic symptom of a dysfunctional system.
A symptom of what?
Of a system based on forced, zero-sum competition for basic security, resources, status. When people feel insecure, threatened, and pitted against each other, that's fertile ground for fear and hatred. And elites throughout history have been very adept at manipulating that fear, diverting anger horizontally, blaming other groups rather than letting people see the vertical extraction that's often the root cause.
So a different system could produce different behavior.
That's the hope in the premise. A society designed using the science of human priorities, one that guarantees basic security, dignity, and opportunity for everyone, would fundamentally remove the conditions that breed that kind of intergroup hatred and rule-breaking. It would allow our more cooperative, per-social tendencies to come to the fore.
So wrapping this all up, this deep dive really shows that the inequality we see today isn't an accident. It's the result of centuries of historical choices, structures, ideologies.
Exactly. And the rise of AI, this incredibly powerful new force, presents us with another choice point of similar magnitude, a truly historic choice.
We can let AI just get absorbed into the current system, amplifying existing inequalities, potentially leading to automated, unimaginable disparity.
That's one path. Or we can seize this moment, use this technological disruption as a catalyst to consciously forge a new social contract, one fit for the 21st century, built on principles of equity, sustainability, and shared prosperity.
But that requires a huge effort.
A courageous collective effort to actually define what our shared human priorities are, and then to harness the incredible power of our new tools, AI, data science, to build systems that genuinely serve those priorities.
So maybe the final thought for everyone listening is this. What does it truly mean for us now to leverage our most powerful tools, not just AI, but our ingenuity, our data, our collective will, to build a society where what matters most isn't just a nice slogan,
but a measurable, tangible, shared reality for every single person, not just the lucky few?
That feels like the central question for our time, something truly worth pondering.
This is DigitView.